So tonight's message is titled "Birth Wars," and you've watched those reality TV. It turns out that reality TV is more entertaining than regular TV. I remember watching this one Duck Dynasty. You guys ever watch Duck Dynasty? Anyway, I watched this one Duck Dynasty where Phil is. I think it's the very first episode actually, but it stuck in my head because Phil's like cutting. I think was it squirrels? No, I don't know what it was. It was some sort of varmint that they caught, and he was gutting them, and he's gutting these things, and he's talking to his boy about, what kind of woman he's supposed to marry, and he said, don't be going after no yuppie woman, she might be pretty, but she can't cook, and she doesn't carry her Bible. You need to find yourself, she might be a little homely. That's okay as long as she can cook. The kids today, they're just saying, we're living on love. But he says, it's only going to go so far. You're going to starve to death. So you need to find a woman who can cook up some bullfrogs. That's what it was. Cook up some bullfrogs and carry her Bible. And I just thought, what wise advice. And we look at this mess that we're in today. As we look at Genesis chapter 30, we saw the beginning of that in Genesis chapter 29, and of course it was Jacob who was going to Padan Aram. He was going to meet with his uncle Laban, his mother's brother, to try to figure out if he could find himself a bride. And he didn't want to take one of the daughters of Canaan, so he was going to take a daughter from his own people. And of course he immediately, even before he really knew her, remember when he first met his relatives, it was Rachel coming with her sheep. And she was coming, shepherdess, bringing the sheep, and, she was strong woman. She was, choice, picking for him. And he, was so excited to see a family member that he, showed off his strength by moving the stone from the well instead of whoever was supposed to come and do it. Men were supposed to come and do it. He did it by himself. Watered her sheep, lifted up his voice and wept, and kissed Rachel. And that was, kind of a pretty intense thing for him. And then, of course, he meets Laban, and Laban, after he's been with him for a month, he says, "You can't work for me for nothing. Tell me what your wages would be. You can't, you're my relative. I can't have you as a slave or a servant. What are your wages going to be?" And he says, "I will serve you." And it's interesting because Jacob, he sets the terms, and of course he has to set the terms. Remember, we talked about this. He's going to ask for Laban's daughter's hand. He's only been there for a month. He's only known this woman for a month, but he wants to marry her. He is smitten. And so he says, "I am going to serve you 7 years for the hand of your daughter, Rachel." Now, of course, he couldn't say, "I'll serve you for 7 months." That's not really going to send the right message to Rachel, right? He has to let her know that she is worth the sacrifice, right? And so that's the whole idea behind the 7. I will serve you 7 years as a number of completion. It's a long time. I'll serve you for 7 years. And he says, "You know what? It's better I give her to you than some other man. So I'll let you serve me for 7 years for this love of your life." And so he served him for 7 years. It seemed like no time at all. Right? And we talked about this. When time flies when you're having fun. A minute seems like a second when you're sitting next to a beautiful woman, but when you have your hand on a hot plate, it seems like an eternity, right? That's how Einstein described the theory of relativity. Anyway, so 7 years goes by so quick. And then the day comes, his wedding comes, a big party is thrown, and I'm sure that the booze was flowing, whatever was happening at this wedding. But when he went into the tent to marry his wife, because that's how they married, was they consummated the wedding, and he went into the tent to marry his wife, and he woke up in the morning, and it wasn't Rachel, it was Leah. Remember, she was like the one with the weak eyes. Hey, he's like, wakes up surprised, it's the shock of his life. And yet the beauty of it is that's exactly, remember, Rachel, Leah, possibly twins, maybe Leah came out just before Rachel, we don't know. But wasn't that the case with Jacob and Esau? Esau came out first, and remember, Jacob tricked his father into giving him the blessing. And now Laban, and of course it was Rachel who put Jacob up to it. Now Laban puts his daughter up to it to trick Jacob. And I mean, it's just poetic justice is what it is. He wakes up, finds out he's been deceived, and then Laban explains, hey, in our country, the firstborn means something, right? I mean, what a slam. Because he had taken away his brother's blessing, his brother's birthright, even though he wasn't the firstborn. And now God is just kind of allowing these things to fall out. Well, he's devastated, of course, and he says, well, serve me another 7 years and I'll give you Rachel too. And so he's like, what is he going to say at that point? I mean, because he can't say, well, I already served you 7 years for her, now I'm going to only serve you 5. No, can't do that, right? It's almost like he has to add more or at least be the same. So he's like, 7 years, okay. So he gives her to him as credit, if you will. So now he marries Rachel as well at the same time he has Leah, and he is on the hook for another 7 years. And of course, it's at that point that Leah starts just pumping out the kids. She has no problem having kids. And Rachel's watching this whole thing go down, and she's barren. The Lord had closed up her womb. She's barren, and Leah's, the Lord looked on her and her afflictions. She's not loved by her husband, and Leah even voices that, since my husband doesn't love me, at least he's given me a child to soothe me. Well, that's only going to go on for so long. And then verse 1 of chapter 30, it says, now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, give me children, else I die. It's pretty intense. Give me children, or I'm going to die. And this is a difficult thing. There is something that is probably equally as painful to a woman, and that is an empty womb. Her husband doesn't love her on one hand for Leah, and now you have another woman with an empty womb, and she's watching. I know my wife and I went through this for many years. We're married for almost 8 years, 7 years before the Lord gave us a child, but just watching our friends, have kids, no problem. Watching her sister, have children, no problem. And not even being able to take care of them. Some of the people we knew having children, not even be able to take care of them. 3 different dads, stuff like that. And it's just like, why, God? And it's such a difficult thing. And yet, I think it's interesting. As painful as that is, it's also amazing when God, that God is with you, and through all of that, all that emptiness, all that pain, God becomes really your comfort in that. And I think that is such a key thing, because when we suffer pain and loss in life, we have 2 choices. We can either become bitter, or we can learn to lean on the Lord. And that may be, that's just one example of something that could happen to you that can cause that, but it's just like, I can't seem to get the right job, or things aren't going well for me, or, I can't find the right guy or girl, for my life. There's all kinds of things in life that we wait on. And we can become very bitter in our waiting, can't we? As we're waiting for the right thing to come, or the right circumstance, or the right whatever it is. And we can become bitter in that. Or we can do something else, and that is to find contentment in the Lord. Because Jesus is enough. And that's a difficult thing for us to want. I think when we say that, we say Jesus is enough, nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear, hey, Jesus is enough for me, even if I never have what I've desired, even if I never get the things I'm dreaming about, even if things don't work out and I don't get the promotion, or I don't get the career, or I don't get the house, or I don't get the husband or the wife or the girlfriend or the boyfriend, or I don't get accepted, or I don't get picked, or whatever. And to find out that somebody's telling us, hey, Jesus is enough, oftentimes that's not what we want to hear, right? It's hard. It's a hard saying. And yet, we can find out the easy way, or we can find out the hard way. And I don't know, how many of you guys have read The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom? Anybody? One or two of you. In that book, Corrie she goes through some really difficult things in life. She was a spinster, which is just kind of an old lady that just never got married. She just lived in her parents' house until she was 57, I think it was. And that's when the Nazis came in and took away her freedom and put her in a concentration camp. Can you imagine? And she just went through trial after trial after trial and really, really suffered, like most of us probably ever will suffer, worse than we could imagine. And at the end of that, she said something that was so profound, and that was this: you will never know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. And I think that Christians figured that out. I think they figured that out in times of intense suffering, in times of maybe being in prison for their faith. And, I remember reading this book, God's Secret Agent. The guy was a Christian and in China and went to prison for his Christian faith. And during that time in prison, he said, it's considered by the Chinese church, the underground church, that you really haven't grown in the Lord until you spent some time in prison for your faith. Like you really don't understand what it is to be a Christian until you've suffered like that. And he experienced that, and to say how deep it is, to have been tortured and to suffer, and then to come out of that and realize how present God is to you in those times when He's all you have, and how enough He is. Paul says it this way, in such a simple way. In 1 Timothy 6:6, he says, "Now godliness with contentment is great gain." And that's an interesting saying. Just being godly and being content with the life that God has given you is great gain. And this is something that my wife and I discovered over the years when the Lord has withheld from us, blessing or whatever. A lot of times the source of that was that He wanted to work out some discontentment in our life. Some holding out for something, for ourselves, wanting something for ourselves so bad, being bitter about it or grasping for something that the Lord wasn't ready to give us yet, and not just being content. And it's almost as though when you become happy and satisfied with what the Lord has given you, that's when He moves you on to the next step. And it's such a difficult lesson to learn because we never want to be satisfied. And yet I think as Christians we should always be satisfied and yet still a little bit hungry. Hungry for more of God, but satisfied with where we are, wherever we are. And it is amazing how fulfilling life becomes when we settle ourselves to the fact that this is my life, this is what I have right now. Sometimes it's what God has put in my lap. Sometimes it's a mess of my own making. Sometimes it's, just whatever, just average life. But it's so easy to find ourselves discontent. And that's where Rachel finds herself. She finds herself, going to Jacob. She's blaming him. Give me children, lest I die. I'm not shooting blanks, woman, Verse 2, it says, "And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Whoa, that hurt, doesn't it? I mean, think about that. It's not me. I'm doing fine over in the other tent. Buns are coming out of the oven over there. But things are cold over here. And so there's a couple things that are happening here. You have Jacob he's having still a relationship with the wife that he loves less, but she's having children prolifically, and his wife that he was the one he loved, her womb is closed up. And part of that was Jacob's fault. And now he's not owning any of it here. Why is it his fault? Because he loved Rachel and he didn't love Leah. And so God closed Rachel's womb because she had love, but she didn't have children. And Leah had children, but she didn't have love. But the children that she was producing for her husband was starting to produce a love. And so it was kind of a messed up thing. I mean, this is like Jerry Springer right here. You know, it's like just crazy stuff. I've never really watched Jerry Springer, but I've heard it's bad. Reality TV that's worse, right? But that's what this is going on. This is what's going on here is you have this husband who is frustrated with his wife. It's your fault. You're the one who can't pump any eggs out. I'm the one, I'm doing fine. And yet the reality is if he would have, been equal with his wives, and it's interesting because his love will shift as time goes on towards Leah more, and her cross-eye, blue eye, whatever she was, weak eye appearance didn't seem to bother him anymore. Isn't that true? The things that bother us about another person, when we've chosen to love them, stop bothering us. And yet when we try to nitpick and we're like, that's not good enough or whatever, those are the times we find ourselves discontent. It's about the time that I'm content with my wife and I'm like, you know what, she's exactly what I want, then she changes on me, right? And yet that's just the way that life is, and God takes us from grace to grace, and we just have to learn to have grace on one another. In fact, it says in 1 Peter 3:7, husbands likewise dwell with them, your wife, with understanding, giving honor to the wife as a weaker vessel, and being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. I think this is interesting because what he's saying here isn't husbands understand your wife, figure her out. That's a difficult task, right? I mean, there's no way that a man can understand what goes through a woman's mind. Women are a lot more complex when it comes to emotions and feelings. Men are more simple. To men it's cut and dry. To a woman it's very, touch and go. And that's okay. That's the way God created us to be. But when he says that the wife is the weaker vessel, what he means, the word there is delicate. He's not talking about, she's weak or she's not as good as man, but what he's saying is she's like something that is to be handled with care. She is not a tool. She is not a bouncing board. She is something that is to be cherished and something that is to be put at high value. That's the idea here. The weaker vessel means like a piece of fine china or a piece of fine pottery, not a metal mug, right? Like a teacup, something that is to be handled delicately. And that's what he's saying. And the idea is that a woman is fragile, in her emotions, and so husbands not to understand their wives would be a difficult thing or an impossible task, especially when oftentimes women will say, admittedly, I don't even understand myself half the time. I don't know why I'm crying. My wife said that to me so many times. I don't know why I'm crying. I'm just crying. And that's okay. The reality is that we have to be understanding of them. And right here, Jacob just frustrated. And that's where men get quickly, oftentimes. Frustrated. I don't know what you want. What do you want from me? What do you think I am, God? And this is the track he takes, and this isn't the track a man should take, right? It says in Colossians 3:19, husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter toward them. And I see this happen all the time in marriage, where a wife is emotionally fragile, emotionally going through difficult things, and her husband does not handle her with care. He does not absorb that. He does not stand strong for her where she needs him to be a rock, and where she feels emotionally out of control, and she needs him to be the stable one and to say, it's going to be okay. Let me pray with you. We're going to be all right. It's going to be okay. Because that's what a woman wants. She wants a husband who is, not freaking out. She's freaking out. She wants him to be somebody she can hold to. And Jacob, instead of being the solid husband that she needs him to be, he wigs out. He reacts to her emotion. And when a man reacts to a woman's emotion, she doesn't know how to handle that. That makes her feel very, very insecure. And the men do it because they feel insecure too. But here's something I've learned over the years. I can handle it. Whatever my wife needs to tell me, I can put my big boy pants on, and I can listen to it, and I can be patient. I don't have to speak. I don't have to retort. I don't have to take it personally. And she may have some things to say about me, which she has in the past. You are this, or you don't do this, or you are, and most of the time she's pretty fair. There might be some times when she hasn't been in the past, but we've been married 20 years, so that happens. But the reality is I can handle it. I've discovered that. I can handle whatever she needs to tell me. And I can comfort her, and I can apologize, and I can help her, But oftentimes husbands don't do that, and I didn't at first either, so I'm not saying I've arrived or anything like that, and I'm sure Shannon could tell you that I have some growing to do. But, this was the wrong reaction that Jacob had to his wife. He needs to be patient with her. He needs to say, honey, you know what? Let's pray. Now, this is something I want you to notice in this narrative, is that you don't see a whole lot of that. Remember back when Isaac and Rachel were barren? What did he do? What are you coming to me for? Am I God? No. It says, Isaac prayed for his wife, right? He prayed for his wife, and what happened? She conceived. Amazing, isn't it? And I guarantee you, if Jacob would have got off his emotional roller coaster, taken a Midol or something and just gotten over it, sorry, if he had done something to deal with his emotions, he probably could have just said, you know what, honey, let's just go before the Lord, and prayed with his wife, and the Lord would have answered, and she would have felt comforted if he would have just said, let me pray for you, honey. I want you to have children. Nothing I want more in this life than to see you have a son for me. I love you. Let's pray. And it would have comforted her, but he doesn't. He just kind of wigs out. So she said, here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, so that I may have a children by her. Then she gave Bilhah her maid as wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God has judged in my case, and he has heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan, which means judge. Now here's a really interesting thing, and I think in our culture, you women are like, what? Can you imagine? Here, take my friend. It's not going to happen in our culture. It's just like, I already know you're looking at her. Stop it. It's just that mindset's completely different. In their culture, it was a shame. And in our culture, if a woman can't have a child, it's people feel bad for her. But in their culture, it's like if you couldn't have a child, it's like you are cursed. Something's wrong with you. God is judging you. And so that's probably one of the main reasons why they had a handmaid. And so a woman who had some stature, who had, the ability to have a personal assistant or personal maid, that was something that her dad probably provided for her in the event that she couldn't have children. And this child that Bilhah had would be considered legally Rachel's son. And so in their culture, it was something that was, it's almost as though the shame is a worse thing than the alternative, which I'm sure that no woman wants to give their husband, their handmaid. But that's what happened. It says, verse 7, and Rachel, Bilhah, conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali, which means wrestling. So she's had these two sons through her handmaid Bilhah. But still, and this is the interesting thing, still not satisfying her, And there's nothing really that satisfies that. You talk about being able to adopt, and when my wife and I were barren, a lot of people said, well, maybe you're going to adopt, And I remember my wife reading me this story one time where it was talking about going to Australia, and it was the story was kind of like, women always talk about how they've been to Australia and how wonderful it is, and several women have been to Australia several times, and they got to fly to Australia, and she said, but then I ended up getting to go, but I had to go by boat, and it took a long time, and it was painful and awful, and so it was basically the difference between a woman to be able to have a child and talking about how wonderful that is, and then a woman who maybe had to adopt or something like that. But the reality is that does not fulfill the same, and we've noticed that in our lives. We had our son Isaiah, which was miraculous. The birth of Isaiah was, the Lord promised it, and it happened. And yet, even having the one doesn't take away the pain of not having more, And adopting doesn't satisfy that. Adopting's wonderful in its own way, but it doesn't fill that need. It's just it's a complex thing, difficult to understand. But that's kind of what Rachel's going through. Bilhah's having these babies for her, but it's almost like she didn't get to go to Australia herself. You know what I'm saying? When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, so now Leah's gone barren. She's had 4. I think she had 4 last chapter. Maybe it was 3 or 4 last chapter. She stopped bearing. She took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob his wife. And so 2 can play at this game, right? I'm not having a child, so now you can have my handmaid. Jacob's just like, okay, whatever. He's just going with it, whatever. And I think more than anything, what Jacob is trying to do in this whole situation, this whole mess that he's got himself into, and isn't it amazing how he starts out wanting one woman, and now he has 4. I can barely handle one wife, and she's great, but I can't imagine having 2 or 3 or having that, that whole vibe. This whole vibe is pretty messy for Jacob, and he's just trying to keep peace in the home. And you have these women fighting over each other, and just you can imagine the tension that's in the home. But she gives Zilpah her maid and gave her to Jacob his wife, and Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, a troop comes, so she called his name Gad. And I don't know. It can mean fruitful, or it can mean or bountiful, or it can mean a troop. And so, some people say it's translated incorrectly. It should be bountiful. She has a whole bunch of children now. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, I am happy, for daughters will call me blessed. So she called his name Asher. And so Asher means blessed or happy. Now Reuben went the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. So you have to understand, Reuben is just a boy, just a lad at this time. He's 7 or 8 years old at the most. And he's playing out in the wheat field, and he finds these fruit. And what they called them were love apples. They were little orange fruits that grew up next to the ground on a vine. And they were they served 2 purposes medicinally. They were an aphrodisiac, meaning they made you desire intimacy, but they also were known for helping with fertility. And so he brings these mandrakes, he finds them out in the field, brings them to his mom. It's hard to say if he knew what they were, but Rachel sees him coming in with a harvest of mandrakes. And she says, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. Notice, you can sense the bitterness in this next section. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. So she's trading. You can have him tonight, and I want the mandrakes. I want the fertility drugs. I want the whatever. And so you can sense the bitterness. And think about this. Who took away whose husband? Right? Wasn't it Rachel who he wanted? Wasn't that the one who's supposed to marry him? And now she's blaming Rachel for taking away her husband. And so it's still obvious that Jacob is still loving Rachel more than Leah at this point. When Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I shall surely hire you with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her tonight. It's just, I don't know. It just is so bizarre. It's just such a weird vibe. She comes in, hey, baby, whatever. He's like, okay, just goes with it. Just going with the flow because he just doesn't know what's going on in this house anymore. Verse 17, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. And so this is the fifth one out of her womb. So yeah, she's had 4 in chapter 29. Now she has a fifth son. Leah said, God has given me my wages because I have given my maid to my husband. So he called his name Issachar. So again, they're naming them. And as we go through these, you're seeing Reuben and Simeon, Reuben and Simeon and Judah and Levi and all these names, all these different names that they're giving their sons. If you notice, these are the same names to the 12 tribes of Israel, because these boys, each of them are going to be the head of each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And of course, Israel, the children of Israel, are these kids, and Israel is Jacob. Remember, and later on, as Jacob, just finds himself, kind of on the outskirts of God's will this entire time, ends up finally coming face to face with God and wrestling with God. And that's what Israel means, is he who wrestles with God. And so that God will give him that new name later on. But now he's just kind of going through this whole thing with his wives and trying to figure out, who he belongs to when and what's going on and what's the schedule. And it's just a mess. The whole thing is a mess. And so it says, verse 19, then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. See how I say this is birth wars? It's like birth wars, back and forth. Like, who's going to have another next kid? It's just a big mess. She has the sixth son. Now, this is significant because Leah single-handedly becomes the mother of 6 of the 12 tribes of Israel. Isn't that interesting? She becomes the mother of half of them by herself, and then the other 6 are between Bilhah, Zilpah, and then finally Rachel. And Rachel will die having her second son. And so kind of a painful situation, but she has 6 sons, and Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards she bore a daughter, and her name was Dinah. Now it would seem, and it's possible, it would seem that all they've had so far are sons. And now this is the first girl. It's possible that's the case, or maybe they've had girls along with these sons here and there, and they're just not recorded. Now, why would I say that? Well, because Dinah becomes a main character later on in the narrative, and so it doesn't name any other girls besides her. She's the only one that's listed. Is it possible to have 12 sons and 1 girl? It's possible. I mean, the odds are against that, but I mean, look at the Colossians. They have 7 daughters, no boys. So, it can happen. It can happen. So, anyway, that's the situation, it seems. And so she has this daughter, Dinah, and she'll become, prized by her brothers, of course, and her brothers will kind of commit treachery against another group of people because of Dinah. Because they committed treachery against Dinah, really. Verse 22, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. So it's interesting because Leah now, she talks about how the Lord has endowed her. She's given me something, an endowment. She names her son Zebulun. God's heard me. God's seen my affliction. And so she's acknowledging the Lord, but now it seems that God listened to her. And it's difficult to know if she prayed or if God just heard her sorrow. And God is near to those with a broken heart, isn't he? And he hears her and he opens her womb. And she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And that is, it's interesting because she calls his name Joseph, which can have a dual meaning, which means to take away, and it means added. It can mean take away or added, and it's kind of a double meaning word. And so he takes away her reproach, but he adds to her a son. And so it's kind of a blessing for her. And my wife and I know very well what this is like. I remember, how many of you guys have seen the movie Facing the Giants? I'm all about movies tonight. When my wife and I watched that movie, and we'd already had our son Isaiah, we were weeping like babies. I mean, we bawl, loud, just like it was embarrassing, because there was so many things in that story that paralleled our life. But that moment when the woman goes into the doctor's office, I'm plot spoiler, so if you haven't seen it, but she goes into the doctor and like the tests come back, she's like, I'm sorry, it's negative. And she was so sure, and we've been there so many times, so sure she's pregnant. Gets the pregnancy test, I'm sorry, it's negative. And she goes out to the car and she's just like, God, I will still love you. If I can never have a child, I will still love you. And she just surrenders to the Lord in that moment. And that's when the lady comes running out and says, no, look, it's actually, I gave you the wrong chart and you are pregnant, and it's just such a cool moment, because my wife and I have been there. I remember laying in the bed, and she comes in with this pregnancy test. She's like, honey, I'm pregnant. Exactly a month later, we got pregnant a month later from the time that she was told that we were going to have, the Lord knew we had been waiting a year. And the lady at her pastor's wife's conference told her, the Lord knows you've been waiting a year. He's healing your womb. Well, another lady said that, but you're going to have a son or a baby very soon. It will be a boy, and his name is going to be Isaiah. Just like such a miracle, the way the Lord did all of that. It's a long story. If you haven't heard it, I'm sorry. But just, all the sweeter for the waiting. You know what I mean? When you can wait on the Lord, and that's what the Bible says. And the lady gave Shannon that verse. She says his name is going to be Isaiah, and she said, the Lord gave me this verse for you, Isaiah 31 verse 40. Those who wait on, or is it 40 verse 31? One of those, it's somewhere in there. Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They'll mount up with wings like eagles. They'll run and not grow weary. They'll walk and not grow faint. And that turned out to be true, for us. When you wait on the Lord, He strengthens you. And when you can wait on the Lord a long time and pray and agonize through that and find contentment even, then that is when the Lord meets you. And what that does for you when you've waited on the Lord and the Lord answers a prayer that has been a prayer for a long, long time, it actually, what it does for you is it strengthens your faith. And it gives you the endurance to be able to wait longer, right? To be able to know that God is enough. And what was cool about that is Shannon wrote, his name is Isaiah, circled that verse, closed her Bible, got on the plane, and forgot. And she said, the lady told me his name was going to be like, it was biblical. I can't remember. It was like Ezekiel or Elijah or something like that, It's like the Lord blanked that from her memory. And it was just so cool, because I was like, I don't know about Elijah. I don't know. It doesn't sound, maybe, I don't know. But let's not worry about that, And so then she got pregnant. We went through names forever. 6 months later, finally, my sister says, what about Isaiah Michael? And I was like, oh, I like that. That's his name. And Shannon's like, yeah, I like it too. Yeah. I said, that's his name. And then she goes back to the pastor's wife's conference like, did you name him Isaiah? Is that what you said? Yeah. Don't you remember Isaiah 40 verse 31? She turns there in her Bible, and there it is, circled and dated, and his name is Isaiah right there. Just totally forgot that she'd done that. The Lord is so amazing. And so the Lord strengthens us when we have to wait on Him. And so Rachel, finally, she says, the Lord has taken away my reproach, and yet He's also added to me a son. And it came to pass, verse 25, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own place and my own country. So at this point, he has served for 14 years. He served for the first 7 years for Rachel, and the second 7 years for Rachel. Now he says, I'm done. I've paid my debt. Get me out of here. I want to go back home. And he says, verse 26, give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you. And Laban said to him, please stay. If I have found favor in your eyes, For I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Now this is an interesting phrase, because we know that Laban is an idol worshiper, right? We know that he has teraphim. Later on we're going to see that, or maybe you don't know that, but later on we're going to see that he has teraphim, which is what the Bible describes as household gods. And they were just little idols that they would have in their house, kind of like enchantments or, good luck charms to some extent. But also, they believed that there was gods attached to them. And we know there was demons attached to them. And this is the practice that still happens all over the world. Whether it's in India or South America, people still have little statues, good luck charms, whatever, dream catchers, all these things that have to do with the spirit world and spirits. And there are demons behind those things and those beliefs. And so he is a worshiper of those things. But here, he's acknowledging the Lord has blessed me. I know by experience, the word says in the English, the Lord has blessed me because of you. And he uses the word Jehovah, or the God of the Bible, Yahweh, however you want to say it, has blessed me on behalf of you. But what we don't see is that the Hebrew word behind this experience is actually the word enchantments. And so he's going before his household gods, and just like the demons during Jesus' day say, I know who you are, Son of God, right? I know who you are. And then even the little girl who says, listen to these men, they are from the Most High God. When Paul and Silas are trying to preach the gospel in Philippi, this little girl, she's saying, these guys are the servants of the Most High God. This demon in her is saying this. He talks to his demons, and his demons saying, the reason you're so blessed isn't because you're worshiping at our little altar here, it's because the Most High God has blessed you because of Jacob. And of course demons would only tell him that because they have an agenda, right? They want him to be able to hold on to Jacob as long as possible and not fulfill what God has promised, that Jacob is to go back to the land of promise, that he is to become the father of many nations. And so he says, I've learned by these enchantments that you are why I'm blessed so much by the Lord. Verse 28, then he said, name your wages and I will give it. So Jacob said to him, you know how I have served you and how your livestock have been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, and now when shall I provide for my own house? And so he's basically saying, I acknowledge that. You know it, I know it. I know that when I came here, that I started watching your sheep, and all of a sudden your sheep multiplied. Where they were, just dwindling before, now they're multiplying. And he says, so what are you going to do for me so that I could provide for my own household? So he said, what shall I give you? Verse 31, and Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Now to me, this is reminiscent of Abraham, who finally surrendered and said, you know what, God's in control. I don't have to fight for my own way. And that is a lesson. If we can learn that, guys, if we can learn that we don't have to fight to get our own way, we will go so much farther in life. We will be so much more blessed. But what we tend to do is try to fight for the little bit we can get, don't we? I want my way. I want to take this ground. That happens in marriage. It happens at work. It happens in life. It happens between friends. What do I get out of this? How do I get a good deal? And that's what Laban's all about. He's like, what deal do I get? How am I going to be blessed? What are you going to do for me? I'll do this for you, but I want something in return. And Jacob finally just surrenders and says, I don't want anything from you. I don't want anything. And that's what Abraham did. Remember Abraham standing with Lot? He says, you look up. You choose one way. If you go to the right, I will go to the left. If you go to the south, I will go to the north. You pick. I'll go the opposite direction. I'm going to give you choice, first pick. And what does the Bible say? The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. When we give up our rights and we say, you know what? You take what's best for you. and we say, I'm going to make sure everybody around me is taken care of first, then what the Lord does is He takes care of us. If you take care of you, you're going to get what you can get, right? But if you take care of the people around you and you put others first, God will take care of you. It's a difficult principle, but that's the way it is. And it all has to do with contentment. It all has to do with all that. So He says, I'm not going to take anything from you. He says, I don't want anything from you. He says this, let me pass through all the flocks today, removing there all the speckled and spotted sheep and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So He's not saying, I want the ones that you already have, but I'm going to take out all the ones that are there, and I will just take spotted and speckled from what comes from now on. So I'm going to remove all the spotted and speckled, and it says, so my righteousness, notice this, verse 33, so my righteousness will answer for me in time to come, so not yet, but in time to come, when the subject of my wages comes before you, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats or brown among the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me. And so basically all the goats in that day, what was considered normal and choice were black goats and white lambs and brown cattle. And so if they're not solid, then they were considered not as good. And so He says, I'll just take all the ones that are born with speckled, spotted, or striped. And you can have the rest. Now that was something that would happen maybe 1 in 10. And so He's saying, hey, I'll work for you for just the ones that come out, just the abnormal ones, the weirdos, right? I'll work for the weirdos. You can have all the good ones. And Laban said, oh, that it were according to your word. Hey, I like that deal. That's what he's saying. I really like that. So he removed that day all the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white on it, in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and gave them into the hands of his son. So he gave them to his boys, and they put them 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. So basically, all the speckled and spotted he takes away, takes them 3 days out of the way. He doesn't want Jacob sneaking out in the middle of the night and crossbreeding. Now, if you know anything about breeding at all, you know that we breed boxers. My wife and I breed boxers, and so if we have a fawn boxer and we breed it with another fawn boxer, pretty guaranteed that all the babies are going to come out what? Fawn, right? And so we searched really hard this last time we bred for a good pedigree dog that was not nearly related to our dog at all, that was a brindle, beautiful brindle dog. And so we bred them together, and guess what we got? Fawn and brindle, right? About half and half. And that's what that's what a breeder does. He takes, if you want all solid, you breed it with a solid. If you want some speckled, you breed it with a different color, and that maybe get some speckled, maybe one color with some of the other color. And so that's kind of how breeding works, is selective breeding. And Mendel's law of genetics and recessive genes. The speckled to spotted, that was a recessive gene. Now, 2 brown ones could produce a speckled or spotted one, but that was a rarity. Again, it was maybe 1 in 10 or so. It wasn't something that happened all the time. And so that's why this is such a good deal. They take all the ones, if you breed them with speckled and spotted, you're probably going to get 50-50, right? So they take all the speckled and spotted, move them out of the way. He has all solid. That's what he's working with. And so Laban thinks, I've got this kid fooled. He's going to be working for me for nothing. So he removes them 3 days' journey away, so nobody can sneak out in the middle of the night and do something sneaky. Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of almond and chestnut, peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which is in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, so that they could conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked, speckled, and spotted. And it happened at the time when the flocks conceived that I lifted my eyes and saw I'm reading in a different chapter now. Okay, speckled and spotted. Then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face toward the streaks, and all the brown in the flock of Laban he put his own flocks by themselves and did not put them with Laban's flocks. So basically, what's happening here is Jacob is setting up a situation where basically what he wants to do is he wants to produce speckled and spotted lambs, and that's what he's going for. And so now it tells us he's taking these weird trees, green poplar and chestnut trees and almond bark, and he's stripping these trees down, cutting strips in them and putting them in the troughs so that when the livestock drink from them, they will conceive. Okay, that's really bizarre, isn't it? What is he talking about here? Well, the nearest we can tell, some people say, well, he did it because he thought that, if they were looking at stripes when they conceived, that they'd bear stripes, kind of this, it's going to in vitro change whatever you see. And so, hopefully you're looking at something beautiful when you conceive your baby, and it will come out beautiful. But if you look over your kid's dinosaur, then your kid comes out ugly. It's nothing like that. It's so basically the only thing that we can figure out, and basically the way it's worded here, is that he did this so that when they came to drink, they would go into heat. That's what the word means. Conceive actually isn't the word conceive. In the Hebrew, it means to get hot. So when they came to drink and saw when they drank with these striped pieces of wood, they would get hot and conceive at the troughs. And so what does that mean? Well, it's very likely that the combination, and we don't know exactly if it was, what the word poplar meant. These are just best guesses when it comes to what types of trees he's talking about here. But a lot of tree bark can act as a fertility agent and also can act as an aphrodisiac amongst some animals. And so what the best guess is that he knew the right combination of these branches to cut up and to put it in the watering troughs, that the lambs who drank, or the sheep that drank from that, would go into heat. And that's what he's going for. He wasn't trying to make them speckled and spotted. Now, how do we know that? Let's look in chapter 31 real quick. In chapter 31 and verse, where is it? It was right here. I had it. I started to read it next. 31, verse 10. And he's talking to his wives at this point. But from 10 to 13 in chapter 31, it says, "It happened at the time when the flocks conceived, that I lifted my eyes, and I saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the flocks were streaked, speckled, and gray-spotted. And the angel of God spoke to me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift up your eyes now and see. All the rams which leap on the flocks are streaked, speckled, and gray-spotted, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anoint the pillar, and where you made a vow to me. Now arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your family." So this is what he's going to tell his wives. He basically says, I was out on the field with the flocks, and when the flocks conceived, I saw a vision or a dream, and I saw that all the offspring were spotted, speckled, ring-striped. And so he knew from this dream that he's retelling to his wives that had happened previously, probably before he even made this deal with Laban, that God was telling him all the offspring is going to be abnormal. They're all going to be spotted, speckled, ring-striped. And so he, following God's lead, basically knew what was going to happen when he brought the lambs to drink. And so what he did was he set up a selective breeding system. Now notice this. So verse 40 separates the flocks that are his from the ones that are Laban's, the ones that come out solid. And it came to pass, verse 41, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in, so the feebler were Laban's and the stronger were Jacob's. So basically what he's doing is he's only giving this treatment to make them bear to the strong ones and not giving it to the weak ones. So you have the weak ones who aren't going into heat as much, they're not having as many babies, and they're having solid ones, and then you have the strong ones, and they're having lots of babies, and they're coming out striped, speckled, and spotted. And so he's basically has this hybrid herd of spotted, speckled, ring striped, or whatever, and then Laban's are just these puny looking little solid ones over here. And so God is blessing him. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. And so that's our chapter. God blesses Jacob as he just decides, I'm going to trust the Lord and not trust myself. So you can see, not only was the first part about birth wars, but the second part was about birth wars, right? Birth of livestock. It's just birth wars all the way around. Let's pray.